Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 160. There and back again. Last time Columbus returned, I guess I'll say triumphant, from his first voyage. He successfully sailed the ocean blue to the Caribbean, there and back again. He didn't find any gold, any much gold that is, and certainly did not find China. In reality, Columbus had just stumbled across the greatest find in perhaps the history of the world. Yet, deluded by his own false expectations, he could not come to grips with what he had found. But now, none of that mattered. What mattered to Columbus was going back. He had to go back. In his first expedition, he convinced the King and Queen of Spain that he could sail the Atlantic. He had done it. Now, he needed to convince them that he was the man to colonize it. To Columbus, the safety of the men left at the fort was his most important concern in returning to the New World. More than anything, this does seem to have been the result of a genuinely held moral concern for the well-being of those people that he left behind. Ideally, he wanted to rescue them. If not, he would need to know at the very least what happened to them. Frankly, the fact that he had made it and returned made the first voyage a success. Now he needed to do something with the information that he had. His plan was to build off of the fort. Columbus envisioned 2,000 colonists settling Hispaniola. There, they would collect the gold for Spain, build towns and churches. They would make the New World a reflection of the old one. Speed was of the essence. In his communications, Columbus was quick to point out how fast the Spanish needed to move to stay ahead of the Portuguese. King João II now had some sense, from Columbus himself, how one might cross the Atlantic. Surely, it would not be long before he tried. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI closely followed Columbus's discoveries and tried to determine how they might best serve the needs of the church. But unwilling to spend his own money, Pope Alexander was also keen to divide the New World up between different powers so that they might effectively use their resources to quickly and effectively spread the Catholic faith. To that end, Pope Alexander issued 4 papal bulls proclaiming who got what in the New World. Most of the territories went to the big two, Spain and Portugal, while Italy ranked a distant third. The Pope declared that the Indies, everything west of the Azores, would go to Spain. This initial ruling would be revised later on when it was discovered that Columbus had not landed anywhere near India and had actually discovered 2 completely yet unknown continents. But, at least in 1493, basically everything went to Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella, while probably not 100% sure what Columbus had actually found, did recognize he was right about moving quickly. On May 20th, 1493, they authorized a second voyage and placed Columbus once more in command. In this new command, Ferdinand and Isabella just heaped titles on top of Columbus. He would be Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of Hispaniola. It sure sounded like he was in complete command. Yet within the same document, they remained careful to make references to Columbus as a vassal. The Spanish monarchs wanted to make sure it was clear who ultimately was in command here. Still, there's no doubt that Columbus had sweeping powers. While in the New World, he could hear and decide all lawsuits. He could punish criminals. He could collect fees and taxes. He was, for all intents and purposes, going to be the dictator of the New World. And an expansive New World it was going to be. Ferdinand and Isabella made it crystal clear that Columbus was both authorized and commanded to discover and claim more territory in the name of Spain. Finally, of course, they wanted him to win over and convert the natives. They wrote, quote, "The admiral shall, after the safe arrival of his fleet there, force and compel all those who sail therein to treat the Indians very well and lovingly, and abstain from doing them any harm or injury. Furthermore, shall graciously present them with things from the merchandise of their highnesses, which he is carrying for barter, and honor them very much. And if members of the fleet mistreated the Indians in any manner whatsoever, Columbus was to punish them severely." End quote. So Columbus was to punish anyone who mistreated the natives. An unequivocal order in words, but in practice something that was going to prove very difficult to enforce. Last time, Columbus was given a paltry 3 ships. Indeed, if you recall, the sheer cheapness of his enterprise was one reason that the Spanish monarchs agreed to it. This time, he would have a fleet worthy of a man trying to forge a new world empire. This time, nothing was too good for Columbus. While nominally the cost of the second voyage was borne by the crown, in reality, loans and the confiscated wealth of the recently expelled Jews paid for it. But given that the monarchs were now footing the bill, there was also less room for fantasy. Gone were all the references to the Great Khan. It was obvious to everyone, at the very least, that there was no Great Khan there to meet. Columbus this time would have 17 ships. 3 were simply called ships. 12 were caravels. 2 were bulkier. Learning from the first voyage, Columbus was sure to get a few ships with a shallow draft so that they could explore any rivers the party came upon. The ships were well stocked with everything Columbus might need, and he received all kinds of men for the voyage, from peasants and criminals to skilled craftsmen. Suddenly, everyone wanted to sail with Columbus. As Columbus would soon discover, however, many of these men came with the intention of finding quick riches. They were not going to share in his vision of building a new empire. And this, as we will see, quickly led to friction. Along with Columbus went 2 men destined to win renown on their own. One was the chartmaker Juan de la Cosa. Later on, de la Cosa would sail with Amerigo Vespucci, who made use of his charts to create the influential maps of the new continents that would, ultimately, lead to them being named North and South America, rather than North and South Columbia. The second man with whom sailed Columbus was none other than Ponce de Leon. Now, of course, we're going to get an episode on Ponce de Leon in his own right at some point here. But for those who do not know, on April 2nd, 1513, Ponce de Leon will actually be the first European to set foot on Florida, where he landed. That is, one of the first non-Vikings to set foot in North America. While Columbus was preparing to leave, King Zhao II pestered Pope Alexander to reverse his papal decree. If the line ran through the Azores, then Portugal was effectively going to be shut out of these new lands. Spain might be large enough to sustain such a loss, but Portugal was completely dependent on its colonies for wealth. To the Portuguese, this was a death blow. So, on June 7th, 1494, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which shifted the important line of demarcation 370 leagues to the west of the Cape Verde Islands. This, of course, only made for more confusion. Did the line originate on the eastern side of the Cape Verdes? The western? The middle? Yet the victory was enormous for Portugal. Not only did this grant Portugal all of West Africa, but eventually the landmass of, right now unknown, Brazil. Columbus departed the New World once more on September 25, 1493. He first made for the Canaries, reaching the islands on October the 2nd. There he tarried for a few days, before setting out for the Caribbean on October the 7th, 1493. He sailed southwest, but by October 24th had still not sighted land. Recall the first voyage took only 23 total days, so it must have puzzled Columbus that he had not yet discovered anything. Still, by November the 2nd, nothing. Columbus studied the sky, and his years of experience told him that land was near. But where? Well, the answer came the next day, when a great mountainous island appeared on the horizon. Columbus had reached the Lesser Antilles, which are located at the confluence of the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. Today, these islands include the U.S. and British Virgin Islands, Nevis, St. Kitts, and Antigua. Once more, Columbus had done it. He had sailed over 2,400 miles and didn't lose a single ship. The passage this time around took 31 days, though he had sailed significantly further south than he realized. By November the 14th, he finally found a place to land. He wrote, quote, "The island is shaped like the point of a diamond, so high that it is a marvel, and from its summit gushes out a tremendous spring that scatters water on every side of the mountain. From where I stood, other streams were flowing in on the other side. One of them so big, its sharp high drop made it resemble water gushing out of a barrel, all white, and we could not believe it was water, and not the vein of a white rock." End quote. As I mentioned before, Columbus, like all explorers during this age, considered maps and charts of the region he explored to be akin to the tech trade secrets of the 21st century. Thus, it should come as no surprise that very little in terms of reliable maps remained from Columbus's second voyage. Juan de la Cosa, Columbus's trusted chartmaker, did, according to our sources, put together an extensive map of the newly discovered island chains, but it has not survived. As a result, recreating Columbus's voyages tend to be an exercise in speculation. Now, Columbus remained eager to sail for Hispaniola and learn the fate of those he left at the fort. But he had to delay when he learned that 9 men had gone ashore without permission and were now lost. It took several days for the men to return, and then Columbus was furious. In a sign of things to come in terms of how Columbus was going to deal with problems, he, quote, punished them for their rashness, ordering the captain to put in chains and placing the others on short rations. End quote. With his men back, at dawn the next day he set sail. 4 days later he landed at yet a new island, St. Croix, today one of the U.S. Virgin Islands. On St. Croix we get our first hard evidence that the rape of the New World had begun. According to the written report of one Spaniard, quote, "While I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful woman, whom the Lord Admiral gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with a desire to take my pleasure with her, and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling, and so treated me with her nails that I wished I had never begun. I then took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly, and she let forth such incredible screams, you would not have believed your ears. Eventually we came to such terms, I assure you, that you would have thought that she had been brought up in a school for whores." End quote. As anyone who's a student of history knows, this would not be the last time that a native woman, or a woman taken to the New World against her will, would be mistreated. Queen Isabella had insisted that all the natives be treated with respect, intending to convert them to Christianity. Here, her dreams of a newly Christianized virgin world crashed on the hard rocks of desire and abuse. Sadly, over the centuries, the latter won out time and time again. By late November, the fleet was skirting the shores of what is today the Dominican Republic. They were about 36 miles from the fort when the group made a ghastly discovery. The bodies of 2 men washed up just where a local river met the ocean. Both men had been bound, while the mangled nature of the corpses made identification impossible. Both men had beards. Most of the Taínos that Columbus had encountered did not sport facial hair, and this led many, likely including Columbus himself, to conclude that the dead men were Spaniards. That could only mean that they had come from the fort. 2 days later, November 28, 1493, Columbus departed for the fort, his pulse no doubt racing. Arriving outside the fortification, Columbus fired 2 shots to announce his arrival. Ominously, those in the fort, if there were any, did not return fire. A party went ashore and discovered that the fort was abandoned. There were no fires, no dwellings. 5 hours later, several canoes approached. These were the men of a local chieftain Columbus had befriended when he was on his first voyage. They spoke for a few hours. Columbus was heartened to discover that, according to these men at least, many of the occupants of the fort were fine. Some had died of illness, and a few others of altercations, but most were well. However, when Columbus went to shore himself to inspect the fort, what he saw did not match this rosy report. He, quote, felt much grief at the sight of the ruins of the houses and of the fort. Nothing remained of the houses except some smashed chests and other wreckage as one sees in a land that has been devastated and put to the sack. In other words, sure didn't look like the remains of an encampment where most of the residents were still doing well. Sailing up the shore, Columbus encountered the bodies of 10 more Spaniards. These apparently had been mutilated and left out unburied. Columbus was bereft. Quote, they had lain out in the open neglected and unburied for almost 3 months. I felt great pain, Columbus wrote. And though I know it happened through their own fault, there is much to be sad about in such an event. For me, it is a punishment greater than any experienced by their relatives, because I wanted to win great honor at little danger. End quote. Baked into this report is the assumption that these men met their grisly end because they had not obeyed his orders, particularly his order not to touch the local women. He had no basis upon which to assume such a conclusion, but time would prove him right. The men were almost certainly all dead, but now Columbus needed to know who killed them. After sending representatives to meet with the local chief, Columbus finally learned the truth. It seems that native women had been at least partially the cause of the problem, as Columbus had rightly suspected. The Spaniards had been living with native women, a fact that inflamed the passions of a local tribe, not the tribe allied with Columbus. And these Taíno men fell upon the fort in the night. They set fire to the buildings, forcing those inside to flee towards the sea, where they either drowned or were finished off by attacking natives. The only silver lining was that the local chief, whom Columbus trusted, had truly been loyal the entire time, and was in fact wounded himself in the fighting to protect the Spaniards. Columbus was still not 100% sure that he believed the story. He trusted that the friendly chief had nothing to do with the attack, but underpinned by racist conceptions of the world, Columbus still refused to believe that the timid natives could harm the Christians, and felt that perhaps an internal feud between the Spaniards had been the cause of the bloodshed. To be fair, we will probably never know. The next day, Columbus set out, determined to find a suitable location to build what would be the first European city in the New World. He took his fleet eastward toward Monte Cristi on the northwest coast of the Dominican Republic. There, one of his scouts determined that they had found the perfect place for a new city, which Columbus determined to name La Isabela in honor of his patron. This scout bragged that the location would be so perfect that it would one day rival the great capital cities of Europe. A boast for certain, but something that Columbus was more than willing to entertain. One interesting aspect of this incident is that it's clear now how Columbus's priorities have shifted. No longer is he desperate to find India. He wanted to create wealth out of what he found. After learning the lesson of his first fort, Columbus wanted to be sure that La Isabela could stand the test of time. Raw, incomplete, and definitely unsanitary, La Isabela was completed on January the 6th, 1494. A dozen priests dedicated the fort and its makeshift church, technically the first in the New World, and then proceeded to hold the first official Mass in the New World. It was a moment of firsts, but Columbus had little time to note the passage of a seemingly pointless milestone. Still, it's worth noting for us today that on January the 6th, 1494, Catholicism officially first made landfall in the New World. Columbus finally had his settlement in the New World, but shortly he would discover that the easy part had been building the place. It would prove much harder to manage. Moreover, do not forget that this time, Columbus was the head of 17 ships. Last time, his command splintered when he commanded 3. After founding La Isabela, Columbus decided to send a portion of the Navy home to get more supplies and fresh men. The decision would only weaken his already fractured hold over the expedition. He would have little control over the men who returned from Spain, and frankly, who had not even signed up to sail with Columbus this time. On February the 2nd, 1494, 12 ships under the command of Antonio de Torres set out for Cadiz, Spain. Torres' job was to return with supplies and more men. But he would also have to give the grim news of the lost fort to Ferdinand and Isabella. But in the grand scheme of things, the promise of gold always outbalanced the loss of life. It took Torres 25 days to reach Cadiz, arriving on March the 7th, 1494. Reaching court, Isabella and Ferdinand marveled over the spices, slaves, and especially the gold that Torres brought with him. Columbus this time was good to his word. Sifting through the rivers of Hispaniola, the crew had found over 30,000 ducats worth of gold nuggets. It was a staggering sum, and effectively silenced even the most ardent anti-Columbus critic at court. Columbus sent several lists with Torres. One was titled, "For the People." It listed its requests as follows. Quote, wheat, barley, biscuit, wine, about 16,000 gallons, vinegar, oil, beans, chickpeas, lentils, bacon, beef, raisins, figs, almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts, salted fish, 300 barrels, onions, garlic, 5,000 strings, sugar, mustard, honey, 36 gallons, molasses, 10 jars, seeds, sheep and goats, calves, 20 of those, and chickens, 400. The second list was more personal. Quote, for the admiral and his household. And it's kind of interesting to see the differences. Columbus wanted, quote, candied citron, 20, sweets, 50 pounds, various preserves, dates, quince preserve, 12 boxes, rose-colored sugar, 12 jars, white sugar, water scented with orange blossoms, 4 gallons, saffron, 1 pound, rice, 100 pounds, raisins from Amquiar on Spain's southwestern coast, almonds, good honey, as opposed to the bad honey, I guess, for everybody else, 16 gallons, fine oil, fresh pig's lard, 12 gallons, ham, 100 pounds, chickens, 100, so 100 chickens just for him, and roosters, 6. Intrepid explorer in the wilderness Columbus might be, but he still expected to live like the admiral of the ocean sea. The Spanish monarchs, by the way, sent it all. While waiting for his supplies and quote-unquote fine oil, Columbus continued dispatching teams of men into the jungles of Hispaniola in search of gold. One team explored a region for about a week, until finding evidence of the locals panning for gold in a nearby stream. Columbus determined to set out at once to see this for himself. Before leaving, he was sure to order that all arms and ammunition be taken aboard the flagship and locked up. He was right to do so. Already the men had started to grumble. Most of them had signed up for the voyage, honestly believing that when they arrived they would simply hop off the boat, scoop up the gold, and sail home. Now the realization that they would need to pan or mine for gold began to set in, and they weren't happy about it. Columbus departed La Isabela on March the 12th, taking literally every man that he could, while still having enough present to protect the ships. According to Columbus, he had all his cavalrymen, or not sure how many that was, and around 400 infantrymen. His intention was to march to the location of the gold and seize it, plain and simple. Led by the admiral, this motley crew of an army marched across a land, quote, of such perfection, grace, and beauty, so fresh, so green, so open, of such color, and altogether so full of beauty, that as soon as they saw it, they felt that they had arrived in some part of paradise. End quote. Columbus recognized that, if this was a massive quantity of gold, he was going to need to protect it. They marched inland about 75 miles before stopping. There, atop a local hill, Columbus built his first interior fort, dubbing it Tordesillas. Leaving a small garrison, he continued on until they reached the river where the gold was supposed to be. There, on one of the steep banks, Columbus built a second fort, this one called Santo Tomas. Well, a cheeky move for Columbus, by the way, whose naming the fort after doubting Thomas was intended to an insult to all those who believed that there was no gold in this new land. There, he dispatched more search parties, several of whom returned with fantastical stories about gold nuggets the size of someone's head. Curiously, Columbus did not follow up on these leads. I say curiously, perhaps to us, but not to Columbus. He knew full well that his position to Ferdinand and Isabella always depended upon the promise that he could get them more, always more. He needed to whet their appetites so that they would continue to send him back over and over again. If he found everything this time, then there would be no need for him to return, and that he could not have. Columbus, throughout all of these voyages, is always looking out for number one. So Columbus returned to La Isabela on April the 1st, 1494, to the news that he no doubt had dreaded. A group of mutineers had coalesced around, of all people, Bernal Diaz de Pisa, the fleet's comptroller. Yep, they picked the accountant to lead the mutiny. Columbus acted swiftly and had the comptroller arrested and confined to the ship. In the fallout after the very rapidly failing mutiny, Columbus discovered that Diaz had been keeping a secret dossier of alleged offenses that Columbus had committed while on the second voyage. Even the usual anti-Columbus Las Casas wasn't buying this list of allegations, failing to see how it was even possible for Columbus to have racked up such a litany of sins in such a short period of time. Regardless, at this point the expedition was effectively fractured into three groups, and Columbus could only personally manage one of those groups at a time. One was focused around the fort at La Isabela. Another was now off deep in the jungle looking for gold. And a third was with Torres, sailing back to Cadiz and returning. In an age before radio communications, Columbus just had to hope that whichever of the two he wasn't presently by would stay loyal. One positive note was that Columbus's men now felt comfortable in La Isabela to sleep on land. It was an improvement in their living conditions for sure, and something that was certain to boost morale. But that was about the only upside. By the end of March, La Isabela was breaking down. The undisciplined men who signed up for easy loot were not accustomed to the long hours toiling in the Caribbean sun and began to grow faint. Food ran short. Columbus responded by doubling down on discipline. He who does not work, Columbus declared, does not eat. The sick were given 1 egg and a pot of stewed chickpeas per day. All around the fort, death stalked the men. To enforce his will, Columbus increasingly relied on violence. This was a problem because Columbus faced oppositions on both sides of the Atlantic. At La Isabela, the source of the discontent was obvious. In Spain, jealous bureaucrats at court were always trying to discredit and unseat the Genoese merchant explorer whom they still despised as a foreigner. As reports began to trickle in late in 1494 of the real situation in Hispaniola, whispers began that Columbus might finally fall from grace. And the worst was yet to come. For anyone interested in more content, check out the website, westerncivpodcast.com. Or, if you want ongoing deep dives, including new episodes on Atlantis, a review of Tom Holland's Dominion, and a new series on the history of Ukraine, check out patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast. Links in the show notes.